Good evening, dear listener, or perhaps good morning if you're joining me with a cup of tea. Pull up a comfortable chair, wrap yourself in something warm, and allow me to transport you back to the gentle English village of St. Mary Mead in the peaceful summer of 1952. My name is Jane Marple, and this is the little tale of how a missing bottle of medicine caused rather more fuss than anyone expected. I do hope you'll enjoy it. Chapter 1. A Disturbance at the Dispensary. The first Tuesday in July 1952 dawned with that particular English softness that makes even the most practical heart feel vaguely poetic. In St. Mary Mead, the roses were at their insolent best, the privet hedges smelled of warm green soap, and the sky hung overhead like a freshly laundered blue counterpane. By 10 o'clock the postman had completed his round, the butcher's boy had whistled his way down the lane, and the village had settled into the gentle, drowsy rhythm that made strangers wonder how anything ever happened here at all. Something, however, was about to happen. At 20 minutes past 11, Miss Jane Marple, wearing a dove-grey cotton dress and a straw hat trimmed with forget-me-nots, stepped lightly along the pavement towards Dr. Haydock's red-brick surgery. She carried an empty medicine bottle in her kid-gloved hand, and a faint, apologetic smile. The sort of smile that suggested she hated to trouble anyone, yet fully intended to do so. The brass plate beside the door gleamed with recent polishing. John Haydock, MD Surgery Hours, 9:12 and 68. Miss Marple pushed open the door, and the little bell gave its familiar ting. Usually the waiting room smelled comfortingly of iodine and furniture polish. Today it smelled of indignation. Dr. Haydock stood in the middle of the floor, normally a calm, sandy-haired man in his late 40s, now scarlet to the roots of his thinning hair. Nurse Hopkins, broad, starched and formidable, had her arms folded so tightly that the seams of her uniform threatened to surrender. Between them, on the counter, lay the splintered door of the drugs cabinet, hanging drunkenly from one hinge like a broken jaw. "Gone!" Dr. Haydock said for perhaps the 5th time, as though repetition might restore the missing object. 60 tablets, 1 entire bottle of digoxin, 0.25 milliamps. Enough digitalis to stop the hearts of half the parish if taken recklessly. Miss Marple paused on the threshold, closed the door softly behind her, and placed her bottle on the table with the air of someone who knows better than to interrupt a storm. She then took the chair nearest the window, opened her knitting bag, and drew out 4 steel needles and a ball of fleecy wool the colour of April clouds. The needles began their quiet, reassuring click-click. Nurse Hopkins turned to her, grateful for a sane audience. "Locked up myself at 6 o'clock last night, Miss Marple. Checked the cabinet twice. Habit of 20 years. Came in this morning at 8 sharp and found this." She indicated the wreckage with a jerk of her head that set her cap strings trembling. "Forced?" asked Miss Marple mildly, counting stitches. "With something thin and strong," Dr. Haydock said. "A chisel, perhaps, or a heavy screwdriver. Marks are clean, no amateur job." Miss Marple's mild blue eyes travelled slowly round the room. The window that looked onto the back lane was closed, but not latched. On the linoleum beneath it were 2 faint parallel scuffs, as though shoes had scraped hurriedly. In the red geranium box outside, one plant leaned sideways, its stem bruised and weeping sticky milk. "Only 3 keys exist," Nurse Hopkins continued. "The doctor's mine, and the spare in the safe. Safe hasn't been touched. Combination known only to Dr. Haydock and me." Miss Marple gave a small sympathetic murmur, and let her gaze rest on the scuff marks. They pointed toward the window, not away from it, as though someone had been in a hurry to leave, rather than to enter curious. Dr. Haydock ran a hand through his hair. "I've telephoned Inspector Craddock at Much Benham, but he can't be here until tomorrow. Meanwhile, every soul in the village will know by lunchtime. Old Colonel Bantry takes digoxin, Mrs. Dane Covington swears by it. Half a dozen others depend on it. If word gets round, there's none to be had." He did not need to finish. St. Mary Mead might appear somnolent, but it contained its fair share of nervous hearts and imaginative tongues. At that moment, the door burst open again, and Mrs. Price Ridley sailed in, sails billowing in the form of a flowered silk dress, and an expression of delighted horror. "I knew it," she announced to the room at large. "I told Mr. Price Ridley only yesterday that standards were slipping. Young Leonard Weatherby was seen hanging about the lane at 9:30 with a torch. Mark my words. Thank you, Mrs. Price Ridley," Dr. Haydock said with strained courtesy. "If you'll take a seat, nurse will be with you directly." Mrs. Price Ridley subsided, but only slightly, and began fanning herself with a church bulletin. Miss Marple completed her row, turned her knitting, and spoke for the first time since entering. Her voice was soft, almost timid, yet it cut cleanly through the agitation. "Dear me, how very distressing! Though I dare say the tablets will turn up. Things so often do, when one least expects it. Tell me, Nurse Hopkins, when you locked the cabinet yesterday, was the window already closed?" Nurse Hopkins blinked. "Closed and latched. I always latch it. Draughts, you know." "Yet it is unlatched now," Miss Marple observed, as though remarking on the weather. Dr. Haydock and Nurse Hopkins turned to stare at the window, as though it had only just materialized. Outside in the lane, a small knot of villagers had already gathered, drawn by that mysterious instinct that conveys alarming news faster than any telephone. Miss Marple could see the top of Mr. Clement the vicar's hat bobbing above the crowd, and beside him the unmistakable ostrich feather of Mrs. Dane Covington's summer hat. She gave a tiny sigh, slipped her knitting back into its bag, and stood up. "I do hope, Doctor, that my tonic is still safe. One becomes so dependent." Dr. Haydock managed a distracted smile. "Quite safe, Miss Marple. Shelf by the door, as always." She collected the brown bottle, dropped it into her handbag, and paused at the door. "Such a pity about nothing, perhaps," she said gently, "though I always think when something is missing, it is wise to consider not only who might wish to take it, but who might wish it to appear taken." And with that enigmatic remark, delivered in the tone of one discussing the best way to stake dahlias, Miss Jane Marple stepped back into the sunshine, leaving behind her a roomful of people who suddenly felt the temperature had dropped several degrees. The bell tinged again as the door closed. Outside, the roses continued to nod, the bees to drone, and the village to settle itself comfortably for a summer mystery. Miss Marple walked slowly homeward, her mind busy behind the mild facade. 60 tablets of digoxin do not simply walk away, she reflected. They are carried by someone who knew exactly where they were kept, someone who understood their value, and someone who, for reasons as yet veiled, wished them to vanish in a manner that would cause the greatest possible consternation. By the time she reached her own gate, the consternation had already begun. Mrs. Archer from the post office was hurrying towards her, apron flapping, eyes bright with the joy of being first with important news. Miss Marple paused, adjusted her hat, and prepared to listen. The game, as they say, was afoot, though in St. Mary Mead it was played naturally at a decorous and ladylike pace. Chapter 2. The Five Who Might Have Done It. By 4 o'clock that same afternoon, the village had arranged itself, as it always did in times of crisis, around teapots. In the post office, Mrs. Archer weighed out 2 ounces of tea with the solemnity of an archbishop dispensing communion, and repeated the facts, slightly embroidered, to every customer. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Pork the constable nursed a half-pint, and accepted congratulations on a crime not yet solved. And in Miss Marple's small drawing-room, the lace curtains stirred gently while she poured a second cup for her oldest friend, Dolly Bantry. Mrs. Bantry, plump and excitable, set her cup down with a clink. "Jane, it is perfectly dreadful. 60 tablets. My Arthur takes 2 every night. If anything should happen to his supply, nothing will happen to the Colonel's supply," Miss Marple said soothingly. "Dr. Haydock telephoned the wholesaler in London this morning. A fresh bottle will arrive by the last post. Still, to think that someone in St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple's needles clicked. "Someone in every village, Dolly dear, is capable of almost anything, given sufficient motive. The question is which someone, and why digoxin in particular?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, feathers trembling in her hat. "Well, I can tell you the names on everybody's lips." She counted them off on baringed fingers. "First, Dr. Haydock himself. They say he has been refused an increase in salary by that horrid new NHS committee. Perhaps he is selling the stuff privately." Miss Marple gave a small, doubtful shake of the head. "Second, Nurse Hopkins. 20 years loyal service, but her nephew in Birmingham has gambling debts again. Everyone knows it." "Everyone always knows," murmured Miss Marple. "Third, Mrs. Dane Covington. Takes digoxin herself, complains it is never strong enough, and has been heard saying she could manage the dispensary far better than poor Dr. Haydock." Miss Marple allowed herself the ghost of a smile. Mrs. Dane Covington managed everything better than everybody. It was her mission in life. "Fourth," continued Mrs. Bantry with relish, "young Leonard Weatherby. Dismissed 6 weeks ago for carelessness, which means, I am told, that he dropped an entire tray of hypodermic syringes. He was seen lurking near the dispensary after dark only 2 nights ago." "And fifth?" prompted Miss Marple. "Miss Hartnell, the district nurse. She has the only other master key for emergencies, and she and Dr. Haydock quarrelled furiously last month about whether penicillin should be given for every sniffle. She called him a dangerously behind the times to his face at the Women's Institute." Miss Marple laid her knitting in her lap. 5 suspects, then, all with either key or opportunity, all with something that might, to an excited mind, look like motive. Mrs. Bantry gave a little shiver of pleasure. "It is just like one of your cases, Jane." "It is nothing of the sort," Miss Marple said firmly. "It is merely a bottle of tablets that has been mislaid. Though I confess I should like to know how the cabinet came to be forced when there are keys in existence." She rose, smoothing her grey skirt. "I think I shall take a little walk before supper. The air is so pleasant." Mrs. Bantry knew perfectly well that her little walk meant reconnaissance, but she only said, "Do wrap a shawl round your shoulders, Jane. There is still a breeze." 10 minutes later, Miss Marple was proceeding at a gentle but purposeful pace along the lane that ran behind the dispensary. The crushed geranium had been removed. Nurse Hopkins was thorough, but the soil in the window box showed the clear imprint of a narrow shoe, heel distinctly visible. Size 7, Miss Marple estimated, or possibly 6.5. A woman's shoe, almost certainly. She paused to examine the back gate. The bolt was drawn, but there were fresh scratches on the iron where something had been levered, perhaps the same tool used on the cabinet. On the ground lay a single pearl-headed hat-pin, the kind only a certain type of lady still wore in 1952. Miss Marple picked it up with a handkerchief and slipped it into her handbag. Further along the lane, she encountered young Leonard Weatherby himself, slouching against a wall, smoking a woodbine with defiant nonchalance. He straightened when he saw her, cheeks colouring. "Afternoon, Miss Marple." "Good afternoon, Leonard. I hear you have been taking evening walks near the dispensary." He flung the cigarette away. "Only because Mother needed her aspirin, and I didn't like to ask Dr. Haydock after he sacked me." "Aspirin is kept on an open shelf," Miss Marple said mildly. "No need to break in for that." Leonard flushed darker. "I never broke in, miss. I swear on my mother's life." Miss Marple studied him. Thin, sullen, but not, she thought, wicked. Then she smiled. The smile that had disarmed generations of St. Mary Mead sinners. "I believe you, Leonard. But someone wishes us to think you did. Be careful, won't you?" She continued her walk, pausing at the gate of Mrs. Dane Covington's imposing residence, Gossington Lodge, no relation to the Bantry's Hall. Through the wrought ironwork, she could see the lady herself on the terrace, reclining on a chaise longue, while her maid administered eau de cologne to her temples. Even at this distance, Miss Marple could hear the plaintive, carrying voice, "Tell cook the sole was overcooked again. My heart simply cannot stand rich food." Miss Marple made a small mental note and turned for home. By the time she reached her own gate, the sun was sinking behind the church spire, and the first bats were flitting above the yew trees. On her doorstep waited a small, breathless, and triumphant. "Miss Marple, you'll never guess. Mrs. Price Ridley says she saw a woman in a green coat climbing out of the dispensary window at 9:30 last night. A woman with fair hair." Miss Marple unlocked her door. "How very interesting," she said placidly. "Come in, Clara, and have a slice of seed cake while you tell me everything Mrs. Price Ridley saw, and everything she thinks she saw." Chapter 3. Tea, Gossip, and a Crumpled Handkerchief. The following morning broke hazy and golden, the sort of day when even the most energetic villager feels justified in moving slowly. At 10:30 Miss Marple set out, basket over her arm, ostensibly to buy ribbon at the draper's, but actually to listen. In St. Mary Mead, information circulated more reliably than the wireless, and the chief transmitter was Miss Hartnell's morning coffee circle at the Blue Boar. She arrived just as the little group was settling round the corner table. Miss Hartnell herself, angular and brisk in bottle-green tweed. Mrs. Price Ridley, sails billowing in mauve chiffon. Miss Wetherell from the library, small and fluttering. And, rather surprisingly, Nurse Hopkins off duty and still looking flustered. Miss Hartnell waved a commanding teaspoon. "Ah, Miss Marple, we are just discussing this shocking affair. Sit down, do. Clara, another cup." Miss Marple obeyed, arranging herself with the neatness of a cat. A plate of Marie biscuits appeared. The tea was poured. The ritual began. Mrs. Price Ridley could not wait for the cup to reach the saucer. "I have remembered something else," she announced. "The woman in the green coat had a scarf over her head, silk, I think, but a curl escaped. Fair, almost golden, and she was carrying a dark handbag, quite bulky." Miss Hartnell gave a short, incredulous laugh. "My dear, at 9:30 in almost total darkness? From your bedroom window across the lane and over 2 hedges? You would need the eyes of a hawk." Mrs. Price Ridley bristled. "I know what I saw." Nurse Hopkins stirred her tea violently. "Well, I know what I found. A lady's handkerchief on the dispensary floor this morning when I was sweeping up the splinters. Initial D in the corner, hand-embroidered, real linen. Not mine, not the doctor's." She produced it from her pocket like a conjurer. The handkerchief was delicate, scented faintly with violets, and the D was worked in elegant white satin stitch. Miss Marple examined it with interest. Exquisite work, she murmured. Mrs. Dane Covington, perhaps? Exactly what I thought, said Nurse Hopkins, gratified. Miss Hartnell snorted. Edith Dane Covington has a dozen such handkerchiefs. She orders them from a convent in Bruges, hardly proof. Still, said Mrs. Price Ridley darkly, it is suggestive. Miss Marple folded the handkerchief and returned it. May I ask, nurse, whether the cabinet door was forced from the outside or the inside? Nurse Hopkins blinked. Why, from the inside, now you mention it. The splinters were pushed outward. I suppose the thief had shut the door again to hide his traces, and then forced it a second time from within to make it look like a break-in. A small silence fell. Miss Wetherell gave a nervous little squeak. Miss Marple sipped her tea. How very odd. One would almost think the thief wished the damage to be discovered at once. Miss Hartnell stared. But why? That is precisely what I should like to know, said Miss Marple pleasantly. At that moment the door opened again, and Leonard Weatherby slouched in, cap in hand, to collect a message for his mother. Every head turned. Leonard coloured to the roots of his untidy fair hair and retreated as though the room were on fire. Poor boy, sighed Miss Wetherell. He has such an unfortunate manner. Guilty conscience, declared Mrs. Price Ridley. Miss Marple rose. I must be getting on. Thank you for the tea, Miss Hartnell. So refreshing. Outside in the High Street the sun was hotter now. Miss Marple paused at the draper's, chose half a yard of lavender ribbon for trimming a nightdress case, and then, instead of turning for home, took the little path that led behind the church to the Women's Institute Hall. The hall was empty, save for old Miss Knightley polishing the brass memorial tablets. On the wall hung the board with its neat hooks and labelled keys, Village Hall, Cricket Pavilion, Scout Hut, and at the end, Dispensary Spare. Miss Marple studied it thoughtfully. The dispensary key was bright, almost shiny, while its neighbours were comfortably dull with verdigris. Someone had handled it a great deal, or polished it recently. Looking for something, dear? Asked Miss Knightley. Only admiring your industry, Miss Marple replied. Such a responsibility keeping all these keys. Miss Knightley preened. We take it in turns. Last month it was Mrs. Dane Covington's week. Always very particular is Mrs. D.C. Had them all down and cleaned them with metal polish. Said they were a disgrace. How very public-spirited of her, said Miss Marple. On her way home she paused again, this time at the gate of the doctor's house. Through the surgery window she could see Dr. Haydock writing prescriptions, his sandy hair ruffled, his face tired. On the desk beside him lay a single pearl-headed hatpin. Miss Marple's lips pursed in a soundless "Oh." She walked on. At her own gate she found Colonel Bantry's gardener's boy waiting with a bunch of sweet williams from Mrs. Bantry. Mrs. B says to tell you the Colonel is in a rare taking, the boy confided. Swears he'll keep his tablets under his pillow from now on. Miss Marple thanked him, took the flowers indoors, and placed them in a vase. Then she sat down at her writing desk, opened her notebook, and in her fine spidery hand wrote, Handkerchief D. Almost certainly Mrs. Dane Covington's. Pearl hatpin, found in Lane, now on Dr. Haydock's desk. Spare key polished recently. Cabinet forced from inside. Geranium crushed by narrow heel. Size 6, 127. Leonard Weatherby's shoes muddy, but with river clay, not dispensary soil. She underlined the last two items twice, closed the book, and rang for her maid. Cherry, I shall want my grey silk dress pressed for this evening. I have been invited to Gossington Lodge for sherry. Mrs. Dane Covington is at home to the flower show committee. Cherry grinned. More like she wants to find out what everybody's saying about her handkerchief. Exactly so, said Miss Marple serenely. and I intend to oblige her. Chapter 4. Sherry at Gossington Lodge. Gossington Lodge stood at the far end of the village like a dowager duchess who had seen better centuries. Red brick mellowed to rose, tall chimneys, and a sweeping gravel drive that announced money without apology. At 6:30, the flower show committee, 6 ladies and the vicar, assembled on the terrace beneath a striped awning, sipping sherry and pretending the theft had not happened. Mrs. Dane Covington reclined on a cushioned chaise, draped in coffee-coloured lace and an air of noble suffering. A small table at her elbow held a crystal glass, a bottle of tablets, and a silver bell for summoning the maid. Miss Marple arrived last, apologising prettily for the heat, and was placed in the chair of honour at her hostess's right hand. "So kind of you to come, Miss Marple," murmured Mrs. Dane Covington, touching her forehead with a lace handkerchief that was, Miss Marple noted at once, bore the initial E in one corner. "My nerves have been simply shattered by this dreadful business." "Quite understandable, dear," said Miss Marple sympathetically. "When one's own health depends upon the missing medicine." Mrs. Dane Covington's fingers closed protectively round the bottle beside her. "Fortunately, I keep a private supply from my London specialist. One cannot be too careful." The vicar cleared his throat. "We must all trust that the police will recover the tablets quickly. In the meantime, perhaps we should discuss the arrangement of the Rose Marquis." But Mrs. Dane Covington was not to be diverted. "I have been thinking," she said in the tone of one making a proclamation, "that the entire affair points to gross carelessness on someone's part. Dr. Haydock is overworked, poor man, standard slip." Miss Hartnell, who had been invited only because she was treasurer, bristled visibly. "Dr. Haydock is conscientious to a fault. The cabinet was forced." "By an expert, no doubt," said Mrs. Dane Covington, with a faint pitying smile. Miss Marple sipped her sherry. "I believe the cabinet was forced from the inside, which is rather puzzling." A small silence fell. Somewhere in the garden, a blackbird practised its evening aria. Mrs. Dane Covington recovered first. "From the inside? How very peculiar! One would almost think the thief wished to be discovered." "Or wished someone else to be blamed," Miss Marple suggested gently. Mrs. Price Ridley could contain herself no longer. "Speaking of blame, I happened to notice a lady's handkerchief in the surgery this morning. Real linen, with a D in the corner." Mrs. Dane Covington's hand flew to her throat. "How extraordinary! I lose handkerchiefs constantly. Maids are so careless." She rang the silver bell. The maid appeared so swiftly she must have been listening at the French windows. "Mary, have you seen my violet-scented handkerchief, the one with the D?" Mary bobbed. "No, madam, not since Tuesday, when you wore the green coat." Mrs. Dane Covington's smile became fixed. "There you are, then. Tuesday, before the theft. Nothing to do with this unpleasantness." Miss Marple set her glass down. "Such a pretty scent, Violet. I believe I caught a trace of it in the dispensary yesterday." Mrs. Dane Covington's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained honeyed. "Perhaps Nurse Hopkins uses the same." "Oh, no," Miss Marple said, surprised. "Nurse Hopkins prefers lavender water. One notices these things." The vicar coughed again, more desperately. "The Rose Marquis." But the conversation had slipped its leash. Miss Hartnell leaned forward. "Talking of Tuesday, I was delivering Mrs. Jenks's baby until 4 in the morning. I passed the dispensary at 3:30, and the window was closed then. Yet Nurse Hopkins says it was open when she arrived at 8. Curious, isn't it?" Mrs. Dane Covington lifted her chin. "Perhaps the thief returned." "Or perhaps," said Miss Marple softly, "the theft took place earlier than we have been supposing. and the broken cabinet was arranged for later discovery. 8 o'clock, when Nurse Hopkins would be sure to find it. The sherry glasses seemed suddenly heavier in every hand. Mrs. Dane Covington gave a tinkling laugh. "My dear Miss Marple, you have been reading too many detective stories." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied, "I never read them. Real life is far more instructive." She rose. "Thank you so much for the sherry. I must not keep you from your roses." On the gravel outside, Miss Hartnell caught her up. "You rattled her," she said with grim satisfaction. Miss Marple looked innocent. "Did I? How unfortunate! Though I cannot help noticing, can you, that Mrs. Dane Covington's shoes, those elegant beige patents she is wearing this evening, have quite narrow heels, and the left one has a tiny flake of red soil on it. Our dispensary path is black, you know, but the rose beds at Gossington Lodge were manured last week with that special red clay from Dartmoor." Miss Hartnell stared. "You think she—" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that someone has been extremely anxious to make the theft appear the work of a careless or dishonest outsider. And I think that someone has made 1 or 2 small mistakes." They parted at the gate. Miss Marple walked home through the long twilight, her mind busy. At her cottage, Cherry was drawing the curtains. "Telephone message from Inspector Craddock, miss. He'll be here tomorrow morning to take statements." And young Leonard Weatherby came to the back door in a rare state. "Says someone's been round his mother's cottage asking questions, and he found a bottle of tablets pushed behind the flower bin. He swears he never put it there." Miss Marple removed her hat and gloves with deliberation. "Then tomorrow," she said, "will be a very interesting day." Chapter 5. The Cocoa Tin. Inspector Craddock arrived at 10 sharp the next morning in a black Wolseley that looked aggressively official among the hollyhocks. He was a tall, dark, pleasantly cynical young man who had long ago stopped being surprised by Miss Marple, and now merely accepted her as a force of nature. He began correctly at the dispensary, took photographs, measurements and statements, then proceeded to the Weatherby's cottage in Tattle Lane. Mrs. Weatherby, thin and anxious, hovered while the constable turned out cupboards. Leonard stood in the scullery doorway, pale and defiant. It took less than 5 minutes. Behind a brand-new tin of Cadbury's Bourneville cocoa on the top shelf sat a small brown bottle bearing the dispensary label, Digoxin 0.25 mg, 60 tablets dispensed for colon bantry. 1st of July, 1952. Leonard stared at it as though it were a live scorpion. "I never saw it before in my life," he said hoarsely. "Someone's put it there." Inspector Craddock's voice was courteous but weary. "Leonard Weatherby, I must ask you to accompany me to the station." Mrs. Weatherby gave a small, stricken cry. Leonard allowed herself to be led away without protest, only repeating, "I never touched it, Mum. I swear I never." By noon the village had convicted him unanimously. The Blue Boar did a roaring trade in ploughmen's lunches and righteous indignation. Only Miss Marple, walking past with a basket of runner beans for the vicar's wife, paused to watch the little procession. Leonard between 2 constables, head down, wrists cuffed. She did not look shocked. She looked, if anything, quietly annoyed. That afternoon she paid a call on Mrs. Weatherby, taking a jar of calf's foot jelly and the way other people take flowers. Mrs. Weatherby was red-eyed but grateful. "He's a good boy, really, miss. Lazy, perhaps, but not wicked. And that cocoa tin, bought it myself only yesterday at the multiple stores. Still had the price chalked on the lid." Miss Marple sat in the narrow parlour and accepted a cup of strong tea. May I see Leonard's shoes, Mrs. Weatherby? The ones he wore on Tuesday evening?" Mrs. Weatherby fetched them from the scullery. Heavy brown brogues caked with mud. Miss Marple scraped a little of the mud with her glove onto a piece of paper, folded it carefully, and dropped it into her handbag. "River clay," she said almost to herself, "from the water meadows below the mill, not the black soil behind the dispensary at all." Mrs. Weatherby stared. Then the tears began again. "Who would do such a thing to my boy?" "Someone," said Miss Marple, "who wished the tablets to be found quickly, and in a place that would cause the maximum damage to Dr. Haydock's reputation. Someone who knew Leonard had been dismissed and would make a perfect scapegoat." She rose. "Do not despair, Mrs. Weatherby. Things that are planted carelessly often grow in the wrong direction." At 6 o'clock she took tea with Inspector Craddock in her own sitting room. He looked tired. "Case closed, I think, Miss Marple. The boy will plead guilty to save a trial, no doubt. Motive, spite against Haydock for sacking him." Miss Marple poured tea with maddening calm. "And the bottle contained exactly 60 tablets?" Craddock frowned. 59. One missing, perhaps taken as a sample." "Dear me," said Miss Marple. "Then it is not the missing bottle at all. Dr. Haydock's labels are printed, not typed, and the ink on this one is quite fresh. Also, the real bottle was dispensed to Colonel Bantry on the 1st of July. This one is dated the 3rd, a clumsy forgery." Craddock set his cup down sharply. "You're suggesting the tablets we found were planted?" "I am certain of it, and I am equally certain that the real bottle is still somewhere in the village, hidden by someone who has no intention of letting it be recovered too soon." She opened her notebook and laid it on the table between them. "Look at the times, Inspector. Nurse Hopkins locked the cabinet at 6 on Tuesday. Mrs. Price Ridley claims to have seen a woman leaving by the window at 9:30. Yet Miss Hartnell passed at 3:30 in the morning, and the window was shut. The cabinet undisturbed. The damage was discovered at 8 on Wednesday. Therefore, the cabinet was broken open between 3:30 and 8 o'clock on Wednesday morning, when no one was about. The tablets were removed then, not on Tuesday night. The Tuesday sighting was either imagination or deliberate misdirection." Craddock rubbed his chin. "But the handkerchief, the hatpin, both planted. The handkerchief conveniently initialed, the hatpin chosen because Mrs. Dane Covington is the only lady in the parish who still wears them. Someone wished us to look everywhere except the right place." Craddock gave a reluctant grin. "You're saying the whole thing is a charade." "I'm saying," Miss Marple corrected gently, "that someone has tried to write a very bad detective story and cast poor Leonard as the villain. Fortunately, real life is rarely so cooperative." Cherry came in to clear the tea things. Miss Marple waited until the door closed again. "Tell me, Inspector, have you examined Mrs. Dane Covington's rose beds lately?" Craddock's eyebrows rose. "Her roses? Why?" "Because roses love bone meal, and bone meal comes in bottles very like digoxin bottles when the labels have been soaked off, and because the head gardener at Gossington Lodge was spreading red Dartmoor clay round the hybrid teas only yesterday." She closed her notebook with a soft snap. "Tomorrow morning, perhaps, you might take a spade." Craddock looked at her for a long moment. "You never cease to astonish me, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled, the mild, disarming smile that had undone greater criminals than Mrs. Dane Covington. "It is only," she said, "that I have a tidy mind, and this affair has been most untidy so far." Outside, the summer evening settled into lavender dusk. Somewhere, a nightingales began to tune up. And in the quiet cottage, Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, serene in the knowledge that planted evidence, like planted annuals, has a way of coming up in unexpected places, especially when someone is prepared to do a little discreet digging. Chapter 6. The Second Visitor. Thursday dawned sultry, with thunderflies in the air and tempers fraying at the edges. Leonard Weatherby remained in the cells at Much Benham, sullen and silent. The village, having tasted blood, now felt faintly ashamed of itself and took refuge in the weather. At 11:20 that night, when most windows in St. Mary Mead were dark, a small, cautious figure slipped down the lane behind the dispensary. The moon was hidden by cloud. The only light came from a carefully shielded torch that flashed once, went out, flashed again. The back gate creaked. A gloved hand reached through the geranium box, unlatched the window, and pushed it up. A moment later, the figure was inside. 10 minutes passed. A faint scrape, a soft exclamation of annoyance, then the torch beam swept the shelves like a lighthouse. It lingered on the aspirin bottles, danced across the shelves of bandages, and finally settled on the open drugs cabinet. The door, still hanging crookedly from the first break-in, was now pushed wide. The beam played over the empty space where the digoxin had once stood. Another muttered exclamation, this time unmistakably feminine. Then the torch clicked off. The figure retreated the way it had come, pulling the window almost shut behind it, but not quite. At 8 the next morning, Nurse Hopkins arrived, key in hand, and stopped dead on the threshold. The dispensary had been entered again. This time nothing was broken, but the place had been searched with frantic thoroughness. Drawers stood open, bottles were jumbled, and on the counter lay a single empty aspirin bottle, its child-proof cap discarded like a cork from champagne. Nurse Hopkins telephoned Dr. Haydock, who telephoned Inspector Craddock, who arrived looking as though he had not slept. "Someone came back," he said grimly. "Came back for the real bottle, and couldn't find it because it isn't here. Which means it never was taken in the first place, or, said Miss Marple, who had arrived with a bunch of sweet peas for the waiting-room vase. It was taken long ago and hidden elsewhere, and our nocturnal visitor suddenly feared it might be discovered." Craddock gave her a sharp glance. "You were expecting this?" "I was hoping for it," Miss Marple admitted. "When one plants are wrongly accused, they sometimes try to destroy the evidence twice. It is a very old pattern." Dr. Haydock rubbed his forehead. "But why aspirin? Why take nothing at all?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "the visitor was startled perhaps. Or because the real object was not to steal, but to confirm that the digoxin was no longer on the premises. Confirmation achieved, the stage is set for the next act." She bent to examine the windowsill. A fresh flake of red clay clung to the paint, and caught on the latch was a single strand of fair hair, almost golden. Craddock bagged it carefully. That afternoon he obtained a search warrant for Gossington Lodge. Mrs. Dane Covington received him on the terrace, reclining in peacock blue silk and indignation. "Really, Inspector, this is intolerable. First my handkerchief, now my home. I'm a sick woman." The search was polite, but thorough, took 2 hours. Nothing was found in the house. In the garden, however, beneath the prize rose Peace, whose blooms were the talk of 3 counties. Constable Polk's spade struck glass at the 3rd try. The bottle that came up was coated in red clay, but unmistakable. Digoxin 0.25 mg, 60 tablets dispensed for Calder Bantry. 1st and July 1952. Label slightly buckled from damp, but perfectly genuine. Mrs. Dane Covington, summoned to the rosebed, turned the colour of putty. "I have no idea how that got there," she declared. The gardener, a phlegmatic man named Briggs, shook his head. "Planted them roses myself, madam, Tuesday morning. Nothing there then but bone meal and my special compost." Craddock turned to Mrs. Dane Covington. "Edith Ann Dane Covington, I am arresting you for theft and for attempting to pervert the course of justice." She gave a small theatrical gasp and fainted into the arms of the nearest constable. Miss Marple, who had been standing quietly beside the lavender hedge, stepped forward with a tiny bottle of smelling salts. "Allow me," she said kindly, and waved it under the aristocratic nose. Mrs. Dane Covington revived almost immediately, eyes flashing fury. "This is outrageous. I wish to teach Dr. Haydock a lesson. His modern methods, giving antibiotics for everything, will be the death of us all. I intended to return the tablets once he had been suitably humiliated." Craddock's voice was wintry. "By planting them in an innocent boy's home and letting him face prison." Mrs. Dane Covington lifted her chin. "Leonard Weatherby is no innocent, and the tablets were quite safe under the rose." Miss Marple spoke for the first time. "Except, my dear, that you buried the wrong bottle. The one you left in the cocoa tin contained only 20 tablets, harmless sugar pills from your own London supply. You needed the genuine 60 to keep your own heart beating. When you heard Leonard had been arrested and the police were satisfied, you panicked. You came back last night to retrieve the real bottle before anyone dug in the rosebed, but it was already too late." Mrs. Dane Covington stared at her. Hatred and admiration mingled. "You wicked old woman," she whispered. Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "I prefer to think of myself as tidy-minded," she said. Leonard Weatherby was released that same evening, bewildered and tearful. Mrs. Dane Covington was driven away in the Wolseley, still proclaiming her innocence to the hydrangeas. And in the quiet that followed, St. Mary Mead drew a long breath of relief, the way one does when a tooth finally stops aching. Later, over cocoa in Miss Marple's sitting room, Inspector Craddock raised his cup in salute. "To the best detective in England," he said. Miss Marple shook her head. "Only an old maid who notices things," she replied. "Though I must say, Inspector, roses do make excellent hiding places. One really must remember to deadhead them more often." Outside, the thunder that had threatened all week finally broke. Gentle, healing rain that washed the red clay from the paths and left the air smelling of petrichor and peace. And in the dispensary garden, the crushed geranium lifted its bruised head, forgave the world, and prepared to flower again. Chapter 7. The Little Dinner at Miss Marple's. A week later, on a cool, clear evening when the swallows were stitching the sky above the church tower, Miss Marple gave one of her small, apparently casual dinners. The invitations had been issued with deceptive mildness. "Do come at 7 for a morsel of supper. Nothing grand, just a few friends to put the whole silly business behind us." Those few friends turned out to be Dr. Haydock, looking 10 years younger, Nurse Hopkins, starched and beaming, Inspector Craddock, off-duty and almost human, Miss Hartnell, still in bottle green but smiling, Leonard Weatherby, hairbrushed, tie borrowed, eyes wide with disbelief that he was really there, Mrs. Bantry, because she would never have forgiven exclusion, and the vicar, Mr. Clement, to say grace and lend respectability. The table in Miss Marple's tiny dining room gleamed with old silver and damask. Cherry had surpassed herself. Clear soup, poached salmon with cucumber, new potatoes no bigger than marbles, and a summer pudding so perfect it drew a reverent sigh from the Colonel's lady. Conversation tiptoed at first, circling the subject like cats round a hot stove. Then Mrs. Bantry, fortified by a second glass of hock, plunged in. "Jane, you must tell us exactly how you knew it was Edith Dane Covington from the very beginning." Miss Marple laid down her spoon. "Oh, I did not know from the beginning. One never does. One only notices things that do not quite fit." She glanced round the table with the gentle, deceptive vagueness that everyone present now recognized as deadly. The first oddity was the direction of the splinters. A thief entering would push them inward. These were pushed outward. Therefore, the damage was done from inside the room, after the cabinet had been opened legitimately with a key. The second was the geranium. Someone had stepped on it heavily while climbing out, yet the soil on the sill was undisturbed. That suggested the window had been opened earlier in the day, perhaps by Nurse Hopkins herself for airing, and left unlatched. The third was the spare key on the Women's Institute board. It had been polished. Mrs. Dane Covington had been key monitor the previous month. She's a lady who likes everything to shine, especially her own reputation. Dr. Haydock laughed quietly. "Go on." Then came the planted evidence. The handkerchief, the hatpin, the forged bottle in poor Leonard's cottage. All rather too convenient. In my experience, real thieves are seldom so obliging as to leave monogrammed linen behind them. Leonard flushed scarlet and stared at his plate. Miss Marple smiled at him kindly. The real turning point was the red clay. The shoes that crushed the geranium had walked in red Dartmoor clay. The only place that clay had been delivered recently was Gossington Lodge for the rosebeds. And the only person who walks in those rosebeds daily is the mistress of the house. Inspector Craddock lifted his glass. To red clay, and to Miss Marple. Miss Marple shook her head. To common sense, Inspector, and to the fact that Mrs. Dane Covington, for all her cleverness, forgot one thing. She paused, letting the silence grow expectant. She forgot that digoxin is a scheduled poison. One cannot simply order 60 tablets from a London chemist without questions being asked. Her own prescription was for 20 at a time. When she needed the full 60 for her dramatic gesture, she had to take the village bottle. But she still needed her own tablets to live. So she buried the real bottle and planted a substitute in Leonard's cottage. When the substitute was found so quickly, she panicked and tried to retrieve the genuine one before the garden was searched. Nurse Hopkins gave a satisfied nod, and came back the second night for it, only we'd already dug it up. "Exactly," said Miss Marple. "Pudding was served. Summer berries bled gloriously into the cream. Mrs. Bantry could not resist one last question. But Jane, why on earth did she do it? She's rich, respected." Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully on the candle flames. "Pride, Dolly. Pride and fear. Mrs. Dane Covington has ruled village health for 30 years, with her committees and her little suggestions to doctors. The new National Health Service threatens all that. Dr. Haydock refused to consult her about every prescription. She decided to prove that without her watchful eye, the dispensary was unsafe. A little drama, a little scandal, and the authorities would beg her to take charge again. She sighed. Vanity dressed up as public spirit. One sees it so often. The vicar murmured something about the sins of pride. Everyone else concentrated on pudding. After dinner, the men were allowed one small glass of port in the sitting room while the ladies withdrew. When they rejoined, Leonard Weatherby stood awkwardly by the French windows, turning his borrowed tie in his fingers. "Miss Marple, I've got something to say." His voice cracked. Dr. Haydock's offered me my job back, training proper this time. I just wanted to thank you for believing me." Miss Marple patted the sofa beside her. "Sit down, Leonard. Belief had very little to do with it. Evidence had everything, but I am glad it is settled." He sat, still overcome. Outside, the sky had turned a deep violet. Swallows wheeled and the first stars appeared. Inspector Craddock raised his glass one last time. "To St. Mary Mead," he said, "may its crimes continue to be small, its roses glorious, and its detective unrivalled." Everyone drank. Even the vicar allowed himself a sip. Later, when the guests had gone and Cherry was washing up, Miss Marple stood at her gate saying good night to the last stragglers. The air smelled of stock and cooling earth. Dr. Haydock paused on the path. "You saved more than a boy's reputation tonight," he said quietly. "You saved the village from a very nasty scandal." Miss Marple looked up at the quiet stars. "Villages are like gardens, Doctor," she replied. "Pull up the weeds promptly, and the flowers have a chance." He laughed softly and walked on. Miss Marple remained a moment longer, breathing in the night scents. Somewhere down the lane, an owl called. Everything was peaceful again. The little disturbance smoothed over, the balance restored. She turned back to the cottage, closed the door and set the chain. Another small crisis over. Another pattern recognized, untangled and neatly folded away. And tomorrow there would be church, and then cold salmon for lunch, and perhaps a quiet afternoon with her knitting. In St. Mary Mead, that was victory enough. Chapter 8. Morning Tea and the Last Word. The following Wednesday dawned cool and pearl grey, the kind of September tea's morning that makes one glad to be alive in an English village. At 10:30, Miss Marple's small gate clicked, and 3 visitors arrived in procession, as neatly timed as a church parade. First came Inspector Craddock, hat in hand, carrying a small official parcel. Then Dr. Haydock, restored to his usual sandy good humour and bearing a beribboned box from the confectioner in much Benham. Last, Leonard Weatherby, painfully scrubbed, hair plastered flat with water, clutching a bunch of Michaelmas daisies so tightly that the stalks were bruised. Cherry showed them into the sitting room, where the fire crackled cosily, for the morning had a hint of autumn, and the kettle was already singing. Miss Marple greeted them with the serene pleasure of a hostess who has planned every detail. "Do sit down. Cherry has made scones, and there is some of last year's black currant jelly that turned out particularly well." They sat. Craddock cleared his throat. First, the official part. He laid the parcel on the table. Mrs. Dane Covington, or Miss Edith Ann Covington, as she now prefers to be known, appeared before the magistrates yesterday. Bound over for 12 months, heavy fine, and ordered to pay compensation to Leonard and to the police for wasted time. She has left for a long stay with cousins in Torquay. The house is up for sale. Dr. Haydock gave a short laugh. The village feels lighter already. Leonard shuffled his feet that suddenly seemed too large for the carpet. "I come to say thank you proper, miss. Dr. Haydock's took me on again, and Nurse Hopkins says she'll teach me dispensing if I keep my nose clean. And Mum's had a letter from Mrs. Dane Covington's solicitor. £50 and pounds compensation. We'll be able to get the roof fixed before winter." His eyes shone suspiciously. Miss Marple pressed a second spoon upon him. "I'm so glad, Leonard. A little adversity is good for the character, but too much is merely unkind." Craddock unwrapped his parcel. Inside lay the recovered bottle of digoxin, now cleaned of red clay and bearing a fresh label. "I thought you might like to return this to Dr. Haydock yourself," he said. Miss Marple accepted it gravely. "Thank you, Inspector. Symbols matter." She turned the bottle in her hands, then looked up with the small, apologetic smile that always made strong men feel suddenly protective. "There is just one tiny thing I still wonder about." The three men leaned forward involuntarily. "The second visit to the dispensary," she said, "the night someone came back and searched so frantically. Footprints in the flower bed showed the same narrow heel, the same red clay. Yet Mrs. Dane Covington was in custody by then. So who was it?" Dr. Haydock frowned. "An accomplice?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, a much simpler explanation." She reached into her work-basket and produced a single pearl-headed hatpin with a pearl the exact twin of the one found in the lane. "This was posted through my letterbox yesterday. No note, only this." Craddock took it, puzzled. From Mrs. Dane Covington? From her maid, Mary Tutt, a good girl, devoted to her mistress for 20 years. When Mary heard her mistress had been arrested, she panicked. She thought the real bottle might still be in the dispensary. She did not know we had already found it under the rose. So she crept out that night to search, hoping to destroy the evidence and save her mistress from prison. She took nothing but aspirin for her headache, poor child. Leonard gave a low whistle. "So that's why the cabinet was left open." "Exactly. Panic makes us all careless." Mary has now confessed everything to the vicar's wife, who sent her to me with the hatpin and a promise to find her a new place in a kinder household. Craddock smiled ruefully. Another loose thread tied. Miss Marple poured fresh tea. "Not quite the last. There is the matter of the cocoa tin." She rose and fetched from the sideboard the very tin in which the forged bottle had been planted. She removed the lid with a small flourish. Inside, wrapped in tissue, lay 60 sugar pills and a folded note in spidery Belgian handwriting. "With the compliments of the Little Sisters of the Poor, Bruges, for the lady who lost her handkerchief." Craddock burst out laughing. "The nuns? Mrs. Dane Covington ordered her handkerchiefs from the convent. When she needed harmless tablets to plant on Leonard, she wrote asking for 60 small white pills for a charity ruse. The good sisters obliged, never dreaming of mischief." Dr. Haydock wiped his eyes. The perfect touch of irony. Miss Marple replaced the lid. So all the pieces fit. Pride, panic, loyalty, kindness, even continental charity. Every human quality played its part. That is what makes village life so endlessly instructive. Leonard stood up, clutching his daisies. "I brung these for you, miss. They're nothing grand, but they're honest." Miss Marple took them with genuine pleasure. "They are perfect, Leonard. Honesty always is." The visitors departed soon after, leaving behind the scent of scones and gratitude. Cherry cleared the table humming. Outside, the sun had broken through. The Michaelmas daisies glowed purple and white against the cottage wall. Miss Marple sat a little longer by the fire, turning the clean digoxin bottle in her hands. Then she rose, carried it to the mantelpiece, and placed it beside a small Worcester vase. A souvenir, perhaps, or simply a reminder that even the most dangerous substances can be rendered harmless when human vanity is gently but firmly pruned. She picked up her knitting, settled into her chair, and allowed herself the tiniest of smiles. Another small disturbance in St. Mary Mead had been smoothed away, like a crease in a well-laundered tablecloth. The kettle sang again. Cherry brought fresh tea. And somewhere a church bell chimed the quarter. All, for the moment, was right with the world. Chapter 9. The Drawing Room at Dance Macabre. The little sitting room at Miss Marple's cottage was never meant to hold so many people at once. Yet there they all were, crowded among the chintz and the china dogs. On the evening of the whole affair came to its quiet, inevitable climax. Dr. Haydock stood by the fireplace, arms folded. Nurse Hopkins, rigid with indignation, blocked the doorway as though on guard. Inspector Craddock, hat in hand, waited beside the standard lamp like a patient stage manager. Mrs. Dane Covington occupied the best armchair. Mink stole draped over its back, a glass of Miss Marple's elderflower cordial, untouched in her gloved hand. Leonard Weatherby, still pale from his hours in custody, hovered near the window with his mother clutching his sleeve. Miss Hartnell and Mrs. Price Ridley had been invited for moral support, and both sat bolt upright, eyes bright with anticipation. Miss Marple herself presided over the teapot with the calm of a duchess at a garden party. "Thank you all for coming," she began, as though this were merely another meeting of the Flower Show Committee. "I felt we should clear the air before any more unpleasantness occurred." Mrs. Dane Covington gave a brittle laugh. "Unpleasantness? I call false imprisonment rather more than unpleasant, Miss Marple." "Quite," said Miss Marple placidly, "which is why I asked Inspector Craddock to delay charging Leonard until we were certain." She poured tea with maddening deliberation. No one else was offered a cup. "Let us go back to the beginning," she continued, voice soft, almost conversational. A bottle of 60 digoxin tablets disappeared. The cabinet was forced from the inside. A spare key had recently been polished. A lady's handkerchief smelling of violets was found. A pearl hatpin, a forged bottle planted on an innocent boy. And finally, a frantic midnight search that yielded nothing but aspirin. Mrs. Dane Covington's fingers tightened round her glass. "These things did not happen by chance point in every direction at once," Miss Marple said. "They were meant to. Someone wished us to see a clumsy outsider's crime, Leonard's crime, while the real tablets remained safely hidden until the fuss died down." Leonard made a small choked sound. His mother patted his arm. Miss Marple turned her mild blue eyes upon Mrs. Dane Covington. "That someone, Edith dear, was you." The silence was absolute. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling. Mrs. Dane Covington rose halfway from her chair, then thought better of it. "This is absurd. I have my own supply from London." 20 tablets at a time," Miss Marple agreed, "from your London specialist. But you needed 60 for your little drama. You needed the village bottle." She set the teapot down with a gentle click. "3 weeks ago, you borrowed the Women's Institute spare key on the pretext of needing to measure the dispensary windows for new curtains. You had a duplicate cut in much Benham. You returned the original polished bright so no one would notice it had left the board. Then you waited. On Tuesday evening, wearing your green coat and a headscarf, you let yourself in by the door. No need to climb windows yet. You opened the cabinet with your duplicate key, removed the digoxin, and hid it temporarily in your handbag. You then forced the lock from the inside, scattering splinters outward, and left by the window to suggest a break-in. You crushed the geranium in your haste. You even dropped your handkerchief, scented with violets, so that suspicion would fall on you just enough to be dismissed as coincidence. Mrs. Dane Covington's lips were white. "Fantasy. Not fantasy," Miss Marple said. "Observation. The handkerchief was found on Wednesday morning. You had already changed to one with an E for the evening. The pearl hatpin was dropped deliberately in the lane, and the red clay on your shoes came from your own rose beds." She paused, letting the words settle. "That night you walked to Leonard's cottage. You knew Mrs. Weatherby would be at the pictures. You let yourself in. The back door lock is notoriously weak. placed the substitute bottle, 20 harmless sugar tablets from the convent in Bruges, inside a brand-new cocoa tin, and smeared river clay on Leonard's boots to complete the picture. You thought discovery would be swift, and Dr. Haydock discredited forever. Dr. Haydock's face was stony. You wanted me ruined. Mrs. Dane Covington lifted her chin. You were ruining the village with your newfangled ideas. Miss Marple continued as though she had not spoken. But 2 things went wrong. First, the police were slower than you hoped. Second, you still needed genuine digoxin for your own heart. So you buried the real bottle beneath your rose piece, the soil freshly turned on Wednesday, as Briggs the gardener confirmed. When Leonard was arrested and the police appeared satisfied, you believed the danger passed, until you heard, through the usual village channels, that certain people were asking awkward questions about red clay. You panicked. Last night you returned to the dispensary to move the real bottle, only to find the cabinet already searched and empty. You took aspirin for your nerves and fled. Mrs. Dane Covington surged to her feet, mink stole sliding to the floor. You cannot prove a word of this. From the garden came the sound of spade on soil, then a muffled exclamation. Constable Polk appeared at the French window, red-faced and triumphant, holding a muddy bottle aloft. Found it, sir, under the rose, just like the lady said. Mrs. Dane Covington stared at the bottle as though it were a snake. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. You wished to be rid of Dr. Haydock because he would no longer allow you to dictate treatment. A theft blamed on his careless assistant would force his resignation. You would then step in as saviour of the dispensary. Pride, Edith, simple pride. The room held its breath. Mrs. Dane Covington looked slowly round the circle of faces, shock, anger, pity, satisfaction. Her own face crumpled, not with remorse, but with fury at being outwitted. You interfering old, she began. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, calm and official. Edith Ann Dane Covington, I am arresting you for theft, wasting police time, and attempting to pervert the course of justice. The rest was lost as Mrs. Dane Covington gave a small theatrical gasp and collapsed back into the chair. Nurse Hopkins caught the elderflower glass just in time. Miss Marple picked up the fallen mink stole and laid it gently across the trembling shoulders. Some hartshorn, perhaps, nurse, she suggested. Outside, the dusk was deepening into night. Inside, the little room seemed suddenly larger, the air lighter, as though a long-held breath had finally been released. And in the hush that followed the click of handcuffs, Miss Marple poured herself the last cup of tea, added exactly 1 lump of sugar, and allowed herself the very smallest satisfied sigh. Another pattern recognized, another web untangled, another village restored to its gentle, harmless self. Chapter 10. Tea and Restoration. A week later, on a golden October afternoon when the beeches along the Yushu lane had turned the colour of apricot jam, Miss Marple held her promised quiet morning tea in the garden. The little wrought-iron table was set beneath the apple tree, whose fruit still hung heavy and red. A white cloth, the best spode, damask napkins, and a plate of Cherry's feather-light scones completed the picture of perfect English peace. Only 4 guests had been invited this time. Dr. Haydock, Nurse Hopkins, Inspector Craddock, and Leonard Weatherby, now wearing a neat white coat and looking almost professional. The fuss had died down with remarkable speed. Gossington Lodge was shuttered, a for-sale board discreetly propped against the gatepost. Mrs. Dane Covington's name was no longer spoken above a whisper. and even then only with the small, satisfied shake of the head, reserved for those who have overreached themselves. Dr. Haydock raised his cup in a mock toast. To the health of St. Mary Mead, and to the lady who keeps its heart beating regularly. Miss Marple acknowledged the compliment with a tiny inclination of the head. I did very little, she said. One only watched and waited, and tried to separate the real from the theatrical. Nurse Hopkins buttered a second scone with decision. Theatrical is the word. All those handkerchiefs and hatpins, like a bad play at the town hall. Leonard, emboldened by 3 cups of tea, and the knowledge that he was now officially in the clear, ventured a remark. I still can't believe she went to all that trouble just to get rid of Dr. Haydock. Not to get rid of him, Miss Marple corrected gently. To get control back. Edith Dane Covington had ruled village health for 30 years, deciding who should have tonic, who should be sent to hospital, who was delicate, and who was putting it on. The National Health Service took that power away. She could not bear it. Dr. Haydock smiled ruefully. I confess I never realized I was such a threat. You refused to consult her, Miss Marple said. That was threat enough. Inspector Craddock leaned back, stretching long legs. And the irony is that the whole scheme collapsed because of a rosebed and a convent's charity. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. The Little Sisters of the Poor were kindness itself. They sent 60 sugar pills beautifully wrapped, believing they were for a parish entertainment. Pride so often borrows the garments of charity and is betrayed by them. Nurse Hopkins gave a brisk nod. Well, the dispensary is having a proper Yale lock fitted tomorrow, and the spare key will live in the police station from now on. A very sensible arrangement, Miss Marple approved. Leonard cleared his throat. Dr. Haydock and Nurse Hopkins are letting me study for my dispensing exam proper. Evenings at the Tech in Much Benham. They say if I pass, there'll be a permanent place for me. He coloured to the roots of his hair. I just wanted to say, won't let you down again, miss. Miss Marple reached across and patted his hand. My dear boy, you never let anyone down. You were merely the victim of someone else's vanity. Remember that. A comfortable silence fell, broken only by the buzz of a late wasp and the rustle of leaves drifting down like slow golden snow. Inspector Craddock set his cup in its saucer. One last thing. Mary Tutt, the maid, has taken a post with Lady Hainsworth in Dorset. Seems she left a note for Mrs. Dane Covington's solicitor, asking that her wages be sent on. Not a word of reproach, loyal to the end. Miss Marple sighed. Loyalty is a noble quality, Inspector. Misplaced, it can be tragic. Properly placed. She looked round the table. At the doctor restored to confidence, the nurse to pride, the boy to hope. Properly placed, it is the making of us all. Dr. Haydock stood. I must get back. Mrs. Price Ridley has convinced herself she has heart palpitations and is demanding an immediate visit. They laughed, the easy, healed laughter of people who have come through a storm together. One by one they took their leave. Leonard lingered longest, clutching his cap. I brung you these, miss. He produced a tiny pot containing a single-rooted geranium cutting, the same scarlet as the one crushed in the window box. Nurse Hopkins said it might take. Thought you'd like it. Miss Marple received the pot as though it were orchids from Kew. Thank you, Leonard. I shall treasure it. When the gate had clicked behind the last visitor, she carried the little plant indoors and set it on the sunny kitchen windowsill. Cherry, washing up, glanced over her shoulder. Funny, isn't it, miss? All that fuss over a bottle of pills, and now everything's back to rights. Miss Marple considered the geranium, already lifting its bruised head toward the light. Not quite everything, Cherry. A woman has lost her home and her good name. A boy has learned how fragile reputation can be. A village has been reminded that pride goeth before a fall. Those are not small things. Cherry dried her hands. Still, no one died. No, Miss Marple agreed softly. No one died, and that, in the end, is what matters most. She returned to the garden, gathered the tea things, and paused beneath the apple tree to watch the sun sink behind the church spire in a blaze of rose and amber. Somewhere in the distance, the bells began to ring for evensong, clear and sweet and utterly unhurried. Miss Marple smiled, a small, private, contented smile. Another small tempest had passed over St. Mary Mead, leaving the roses a little shaken perhaps, but still blooming. And tomorrow there would be church, and cold ham for lunch, and the new geranium to water. Life, as she often remarked, went on very much the same. And in St. Mary Mead, that was the greatest triumph of all.